For most of my life, I was convinced that needing no one was the highest form of intelligence. Not arrogance, not coldness, intelligence. Because I had watched what need does to people. I had seen how dependence creates weakness, how attachment creates exposure, how the moment you genuinely need another person, you hand them something you can never fully take back. So I made a decision, not consciously, not in a single moment, but gradually, quietly, completely. I decided I would never be that person. And for years, I wasn't. Until the night I sat alone in a room that had everything I had ever worked for and realized the silence wasn't peaceful anymore. It was just empty. There is a version of strength that looks impressive from the outside. It stands tall. It speaks with certainty. It moves through difficulty without visible struggle. It handles every problem methodically. It processes every setback quietly. It never asks for help because it never appears to need any. I performed that version for a long time. Not consciously, not deliberately. It wasn't a decision I made one morning. It wasn't a mask I chose to wear. It developed slowly, the way most protective systems develop, through repetition, through reward, through the gradual understanding that self-sufficiency attracted a certain kind of respect that vulnerability never did. People admired the version of me that needed nothing. They trusted it. They relied on it. They brought their own problems to it because it seemed stable enough to hold the weight. And somewhere in the process of being that for everyone else, I forgot to question whether I had ever actually chosen it. That is the thing about performed strength. It becomes indistinguishable from real strength over time, not to others, to yourself. You stop noticing the performance because the performance never stops. It runs continuously, quietly, in the background of every interaction, every relationship, every moment of apparent ease. And the world reinforces it. Every time you handle something alone, it confirms that you can. Every time you solve a problem without asking for help, it proves the system works. Every time someone says you seem unshakable, it adds another layer to an identity you never consciously built, but have somehow become completely responsible for maintaining. That is how the trap closes. Not dramatically, not all at once, gradually, one confirmation at a time. One quiet decision at a time. One moment of chosen silence at a time, until silence becomes default, and default becomes identity, and identity becomes the only version of yourself you know how to be. I became very good at not needing anyone, or more precisely, I became very good at not appearing to need anyone, because the need never disappeared. It does not disappear. That is not how human architecture works. The need for connection, for understanding, for the specific kind of quiet that only comes from being genuinely known by another person. That need is structural. It is built into the foundation. You cannot remove it. You can only bury it deeply enough that you stop hearing it. I buried it deeply. For years, I operated from a position of complete self-containment. Everything that needed to be processed, I processed alone. Everything that needed to be decided, I decided alone. Everything that needed to be felt, I felt alone, quietly, efficiently, without bringing anyone else into the process. And it worked. That is the honest admission. It worked. The system functioned. The results were measurable. The life I constructed using that approach was stable, successful, exactly what it appeared to be from the outside. But somewhere beneath the stability, something else was happening. Something quieter, something that did not interfere with the functioning but refused to disappear despite it. A kind of tiredness that sleep never fully addressed, not physical exhaustion, something more fundamental. The exhaustion that comes from maintaining a version of yourself that requires constant energy to sustain. The exhaustion of always being the person who handles things, always being the person who does not struggle, always being the person everyone else measures their own resilience against. I did not recognize it for what it was. I called it other things. Introversion, focus, discipline. Preference for solitude. Every label that made the pattern sound like a choice rather than a system I had never actually examined. Because examining it would have required admitting something I was not ready to admit. That the self-sufficiency I had spent years perfecting was not strength. It was protection. Protection has a price that does not appear on the invoice immediately. You do not feel it in the beginning. In the beginning, protection feels like wisdom. It feels like the intelligent response to a world that has demonstrated repeatedly that vulnerability creates exposure, and exposure creates risk, and risk creates the kind of pain that takes longer to recover from than it does to avoid. So you build systems, invisible ones, the kind that operate beneath conscious awareness, the kind that assess every new person who enters your life and quietly determine how far in they are allowed to come, the kind that create warmth on the surface while maintaining distance underneath, the kind that allow you to be present in a room, engaged in a conversation, genuinely interested in another person, while simultaneously ensuring that nothing reaches far enough to actually matter in the way that dangerous things matter. I was very skilled at this. I could be in a conversation completely. I could listen, respond, ask the right questions, create the experience of genuine connection for another person, and I could walk away from that conversation unchanged. Not because I did not care, because the system worked faster than caring could. Before anything reached the level where it would cost me something to lose, it was already categorized, already filed, already placed at a safe and manageable distance. Most people never noticed. They experienced the warmth. They felt heard. They believed the connection was mutual because from their side, it felt real. And in a sense, it was real. I was not performing interest. I did not have. I was not manufacturing engagement. The connection existed. I simply ensured it existed at a depth that could not threaten anything important. That is the sophisticated version of isolation, not the obvious kind. Not the kind that pushes people away visibly, not the kind that makes others feel rejected or unwelcome, the kind that draws people close enough that they never realize they have not actually arrived anywhere, the kind that creates the appearance of intimacy without the reality of it. And for years, I believed this was simply how I operated. This was my nature. Some people needed deep connection to feel whole. I did not. Some people required the kind of closeness that makes distance painful. I had evolved beyond that particular requirement. That is what I told myself. The truth was different. The truth was that I had learned early and learned thoroughly that needing people created a specific kind of vulnerability that I could not control. And things I could not control made me uncomfortable in a way that went far deeper than discomfort. They activated something older, something that had decided long before I was conscious enough to question the decision that safety lived in self-containment. Need someone and you hand them something real, something that can be used, something that can be withdrawn, something that can disappear at exactly the moment you have arranged your entire internal world around its presence. I had experienced enough versions of that particular lesson to stop requiring repetition, so the walls went up, quietly, efficiently, invisibly, and life continued, and the system worked. And I became the person who had everything handled, who needed nothing from anyone, who moved through the world with a completeness that others admired and occasionally envied. And somewhere inside all of that functioning, something very quiet was waiting. Not for rescue, not for permission, not for the perfect person to arrive with the right combination of qualities to finally break through. Just waiting, the way fundamental truths wait, without urgency, without demand, with the patient certainty of something that knows it does not need to force itself. It simply needs to persist until the defenses grow tired enough to stop. Defenses do grow tired. That is the thing. No one tells you about the walls you build to keep the world at a manageable distance. They require maintenance. Constant, quiet, exhausting maintenance. Every new person who arrives requires assessment. Every genuine moment that surfaces requires redirection. Every instance of real feeling that moves toward the surface requires management. You can do it for years. I did it for years. But maintenance has a cumulative cost. And at some point, the cost of keeping everything out begins to exceed the cost of letting something in. I did not reach that point through wisdom. I reached it through exhaustion. Not a dramatic collapse. Not a breakdown. Not some moment of crisis that forced everything into the open. Just a gradual, quiet wearing down of a system that had run without interruption for too long. Like a machine that has never been serviced. Not broken, not failed. Just slightly less efficient than it used to be. Slightly less convincing. slightly less certain that the effort was still worth what it was costing. That is when things began to shift. Not because I decided to change, not because I chose vulnerability, not because I arrived at some philosophical conclusion about the value of connection, simply because I was tired. And for the first time in a very long time, I did not have the energy to pretend I was not. Exhaustion changes things. Not immediately, not visibly, but internally, at the level where all real changes actually happen, exhaustion removes something that logic never could. It removes the motivation to keep pretending. And when pretending stops, even briefly, even partially, even just in the quiet moments when no one is watching and there is no performance required, reality moves in to fill the space. Reality had been waiting a long time. The first thing I noticed was not a feeling. It was a question. A question that appeared one evening without invitation, without warning, without any preceding thought that should have led to it. The question was simple. Who actually knows me? Not who knows my accomplishments. Not who knows my opinions. Not who knows the version of me that shows up in rooms and handles things and speaks with the kind of certainty that makes other people feel steadier. Who knows the parts that exist beneath all of that? The parts that have never been explained because explaining them would have required letting someone close enough to need an explanation. I sat with that question for a long time, and the honest answer was uncomfortable in a way I had not anticipated. Not because the answer was no one. That answer would have been easier. Easier to dismiss, easier to rationalize, easier to file away under chosen solitude and deliberate independence. The uncomfortable answer was that I had never allowed anyone close enough to find out. That is different. No one knowing you is a circumstance. Never allowing anyone to know you is a decision. And decisions carry a weight that circumstances do not, because decisions imply agency. And agency implies that somewhere along the way, I had chosen this, not consciously, not with full awareness, but chosen it nonetheless. That realization did not arrive with drama. It arrived quietly, the way most important realizations do. Not as a revelation, but as a recognition. The slow acknowledgement of something that had probably always been true, but required exactly this level of exhaustion to finally become visible. I had built something impressive, a life that functioned beautifully from the outside, a mind that processed everything efficiently, a reputation built on reliability and self-sufficiency, and the kind of steady competence that people trust without question. A complete external architecture. And inside it, a specific and carefully maintained emptiness. Not the emptiness of someone who has lost something. The emptiness of someone who has never allowed anything to fully arrive. Those two versions feel different. Loss carries grief. This carried something quieter, something closer to the dull awareness of a room that has never been furnished. Not tragic, just bare, just waiting. Just unchanged by the years that had passed through it. I did not know what to do with that awareness. For weeks, I carried it without acting on it. Old habits do not dissolve because you recognize them. Recognition is the beginning, not the resolution. I still maintained the same distances. I still operated behind the same systems. I still processed everything alone, efficiently, without bringing anyone into the process. But something had shifted in the quality of the silence. Before the question, silence had been neutral, a preferred state, a condition that allowed thinking without interruption, processing without interference, existing without the energy cost of managing another person's presence. After the question, silence had weight, not unbearable weight, not the kind that demands immediate action, just enough weight that I could no longer pretend it was simply the absence of sound. It was the absence of something else, something I had spent years convincing myself I did not require. And now I could not unconvince myself. That is the problem with honest questions. They cannot be unasked. Once the mind has genuinely confronted something, once it has looked at a truth directly and held it long enough to recognize its shape, that truth does not return to invisibility. It simply waits at a level of awareness just beneath daily functioning, patient, unchanging, occasionally surfacing in unexpected moments to remind you that it is still there, still unanswered, still waiting for a response. The response I had always given was silence, redirect, return to functioning, file the awareness somewhere manageable, and continue. This time, something different happened. This time, instead of redirecting, I stayed with it. Not because I had become braver. Not because something had fundamentally changed in my relationship with vulnerability. Simply because the redirection required energy I no longer had to spare. And staying with it, just sitting in the presence of the question without immediately moving away from it, revealed something unexpected. The emptiness was not comfortable. It had never been comfortable. I had simply been too busy maintaining the system to notice that the system was costing more than it was providing. That was the crack. Not a collapse. Not a transformation. A crack. A small, quiet opening in a wall that had been sealed for so long I had forgotten it was a wall at all and had started calling it a personality. Through that crack, something began to move, slowly at first, almost imperceptibly. Just the faint awareness that perhaps the architecture I had spent years constructing was not protecting me from something dangerous. It was protecting me from something necessary. Exhaustion changes things. Not immediately, not visibly. But internally, at the level where all real changes actually happen, exhaustion removes something that logic never could. It removes the motivation to keep pretending. And when pretending stops, even briefly, even partially, even just in the quiet moments when no one is watching and there is no performance required, reality moves in to fill the space. Reality had been waiting a long time. The first thing I noticed was not a feeling. It was a question. A question that appeared one evening without invitation, without warning, without any preceding thought that should have led to it. The question was simple. Who actually knows me? Not who knows my accomplishments. Not who knows my opinions. Not who knows the version of me that shows up in rooms and handles things and speaks with the kind of certainty that makes other people feel steadier. Who knows the parts that exist beneath all of that? The parts that have never been explained, because explaining them would have required letting someone close enough to need an explanation. I sat with that question for a long time, and the honest answer was uncomfortable in a way I had not anticipated. Not because the answer was no one. That answer would have been easier. Easier to dismiss, easier to rationalize, easier to file away under chosen solitude and deliberate independence. The uncomfortable answer was that I had never allowed anyone close enough to find out. That is different. No one knowing you is a circumstance. Never allowing anyone to know you is a decision. And decisions carry a weight that circumstances do not. Because decisions imply agency. And agency implies that somewhere along the way, I had chosen this. Not consciously. Not with full awareness. But chosen it nonetheless. That realization did not arrive with drama. It arrived quietly, the way most important realizations do. Not as a revelation, but as a recognition. The slow acknowledgement of something that had probably always been true, but required exactly this level of exhaustion to finally become visible. I had built something impressive, a life that functioned beautifully from the outside, a mind that processed everything efficiently, a reputation built on reliability and self-sufficiency, and the kind of steady competence that people trust without question. A complete external architecture. And inside it, a specific and carefully maintained emptiness. Not the emptiness of someone who has lost something. The emptiness of someone who has never allowed anything to fully arrive. Those two versions feel different. Loss carries grief. This carried something quieter, something closer to the dull awareness of a room that has never been furnished. Not tragic, just bare, just waiting, just unchanged by the years that had passed through it. I did not know what to do with that awareness. For weeks, I carried it without acting on it. Old habits do not dissolve because you recognize them. Recognition is the beginning, not the resolution. I still maintained the same distances. I still operated behind the same systems. I still processed everything alone, efficiently, without bringing anyone into the process. But something had shifted in the quality of the silence. Before the question, silence had been neutral, a preferred state. A condition that allowed thinking without interruption, processing without interference, existing without the energy cost of managing another person's presence. After the question, silence had weight. Not unbearable weight. Not the kind that demands immediate action. Just enough weight that I could no longer pretend it was simply the absence of sound. It was the absence of something else. Something I had spent years convincing myself I did not require, and now I could not unconvince myself. That is the problem with honest questions. They cannot be unasked. Once the mind has genuinely confronted something, once it has looked at a truth directly and held it long enough to recognize its shape, that truth does not return to invisibility. It simply waits at a level of awareness just beneath daily functioning, patient, unchanging, occasionally surfacing in unexpected moments to remind you that it is still there, still unanswered, still waiting for a response. The response I had always given was silence, redirect, return to functioning, file the awareness somewhere manageable and continue. This time, something different happened. This time, instead of redirecting, I stayed with it. Not because I had become braver, not because something had fundamentally changed in my relationship with vulnerability. Simply because the redirection required energy I no longer had to spare. And staying with it, just sitting in the presence of the question without immediately moving away from it, revealed something unexpected. The emptiness was not comfortable. It had never been comfortable. I had simply been too busy maintaining the system to notice that the system was costing more than it was providing. That was the crack. Not a collapse. Not a transformation. A crack. A small, quiet opening in a wall that had been sealed for so long I had forgotten it was a wall at all and had started calling it a personality. Through that crack, something began to move. Slowly at first. Almost imperceptibly. Just the faint awareness that perhaps the architecture I had spent years constructing was not protecting me from something dangerous. It was protecting me from something necessary. There is a difference between needing people and needing a specific person. I had spent years confusing the two. Needing people in the general sense felt manageable. It felt like a design feature I could acknowledge intellectually without allowing it to affect anything practically. Yes, humans are social creatures. Yes, connection has documented benefits. Yes, isolation has documented costs. These were facts I could hold at the comfortable distance of information without allowing them to become personal. Needing a specific person is different. Needing a specific person means that the gap cannot be filled by just anyone. It means that the particular quality of understanding that one person provides does not exist in replaceable form somewhere else. It means that their absence creates a specific shape of emptiness that presence in general cannot address. That kind of need is the dangerous kind, because it cannot be managed through systems. It cannot be redirected through discipline. It cannot be resolved by becoming more self-sufficient or more capable or more independent. It exists precisely in the space where self-sufficiency ends. In the part of human experience that was never designed to be handled alone, I had avoided that kind of need my entire life, not because I had never encountered someone who could have become that necessary, but because every time the possibility appeared, the system activated. The assessment happened. The distance was maintained. The connection was allowed to exist at a depth that was safe, that was manageable, that was categorically incapable of becoming the kind that would cost something real to lose. And then something changed. Not in a single moment, not through a dramatic event, but through a gradual accumulation of small recognitions that eventually reached a weight I could not continue carrying without acknowledging what it was. Someone had arrived at a level of my awareness that the system had not prevented. I did not understand how it had happened. I had not lowered the walls consciously. I had not made a decision to allow greater access. I had not chosen vulnerability in any moment I could identify or point to. The system had run exactly as it always had. And yet, something had gotten through, not past the walls, not over them, not by dismantling them, but as though the walls, for the first time, had simply not applied. As though whatever assessment mechanism I had spent years developing had encountered something and, instead of filing it at a safe distance, had quietly stepped aside. I noticed it the way you notice a change in temperature. Not by observing the temperature directly, but by realizing that you have already adjusted to it, that your body has already responded, that something has already shifted in the way you are moving through the environment without any conscious decision having been made. That is how I realized it. Not by feeling something new, by noticing that I had already been feeling it. that it had already been present, that the adjustment had already happened somewhere below the level of my awareness, while I was busy maintaining the performance of someone who did not need adjusting. And once I noticed it, I could not unnotice it. The specific quality of attention I paid to one person's perspective. The way certain thoughts felt incomplete until I had considered how they would appear from a particular angle of understanding. The way silence changed its texture depending on whether that presence existed somewhere beyond it. These were not dramatic observations. They were quiet ones. But quiet observations about fundamental things carry more weight than dramatic observations about surface things. And these observations were about something fundamental, something that had reorganized itself inside my internal framework without asking permission and without announcing its arrival. Someone had become necessary, not in the way I had always feared necessity, not in the way that creates dependence or fragility or the specific vulnerability of someone whose stability relies entirely on another person's continued presence, in a quieter way. In the way that certain things become part of your thinking, not because you chose them, but because they arrived and fit so precisely into a space you did not know existed, that removing them would require removing part of the structure itself. That is a different kind of need. And recognizing it required me to confront something I had avoided with extraordinary consistency for an extraordinarily long time. That self-sufficiency, taken far enough, stops being strength and becomes loss. Not the dramatic loss of something you once had. The quiet loss of something you never allowed yourself to reach for, the accumulation of connections that remained at safe distances, the conversations that stayed on the surface because depth would have required risk, the moments of genuine understanding that passed without acknowledgement because acknowledgement would have meant admission, all of it, quietly, amounting to a life that functioned perfectly and felt incomplete in a way I had no language for because I had spent years insisting the incompleteness did not exist. It existed. It had always existed. I had simply been too committed to the performance of not needing anything to allow myself to see it clearly. There is no dramatic story to tell here. And I think that is the most important part of what I am trying to say. Because we are conditioned to expect transformation to arrive with weight, with an event significant enough to justify the shift, with a moment clear enough to point to and say, there. That is where everything changed. That is the before and after. That is the line that divided who I was from who I became. That line does not exist. What exists instead is a series of ordinary moments that accumulated quietly until their combined weight became impossible to carry without acknowledgement. A conversation that ended and left something unresolved in a way previous conversations never had. A silence that felt different from other silences, not in its length, but in its texture. A thought that appeared in the middle of an unrelated task and refused to be redirected the way thoughts usually could be redirected. Small things, individually meaningless, collectively impossible to dismiss. That is how it actually happens. Not in the moments we prepare speeches about. Not in the experiences we later frame as turning points. In the quiet accumulation of ordinary instants that the mind keeps returning to, not because they were significant, but because something in them was true. And truth has a persistence that significance lacks. Significant moments fade. Truth does not fade. Truth simply waits at whatever level of awareness you have pushed it to and continues existing there, unchanged, until the distance between where it lives and where you live becomes too uncomfortable to maintain. I reached that point on an evening I could not have predicted. Nothing special had occurred. No conversation had taken place that should have mattered more than the ones before it. No realization had arrived fully formed to demand immediate response. I was simply sitting in the quiet of my own thoughts, moving through the ordinary processing of an ordinary day when something shifted. Not dramatically, just finally. The way a door shifts when the last resistance gives way. No force required. No dramatic push. Just the quiet giving of something that had been held in place by effort, and the equally quiet recognition that the effort had stopped. I stopped pretending, not as a decision, as an exhaustion. The pretending simply ran out of energy to continue, and I sat in the sudden absence of it and felt something I had not expected to feel. Not vulnerability, not fear, relief. The specific and unmistakable relief of putting down something heavy that you have been carrying so long you forgot it had weight. of releasing a tension that had been present so consistently it had stopped registering as tension and started registering as normal, of existing briefly without the constant low-level effort of maintaining a version of yourself that was never entirely true. That relief frightened me more than the vulnerability would have, because vulnerability I had a system for. Vulnerability I knew how to manage. I had spent years developing sophisticated responses to the possibility of vulnerability, ways to redirect it, contain it, ensure it never reached a level where it could cause actual damage. Relief I had no system for. Relief implied that something had been wrong. Relief implied that the system I had defended and maintained and organized my entire internal life around had been costing me something I had not been accounting for. Relief implied that the self-sufficient, unaffected, thoroughly contained version of myself that I had spent years perfecting was not, in fact, the ideal state I had convinced myself it was. Relief implied that I had been wrong. And being wrong about something this fundamental, something this central to my identity, something I had built this much of my life around, that was not a comfortable realization to sit with, but I sat with it. For the first time in a very long time, I did not redirect. I did not manage. I did not file the feeling somewhere safe and return to functioning as though it had not appeared. I sat with it. And what I found underneath the relief was something quieter still. Grief. Not overwhelming grief. Not the kind that demands expression or creates visible disruption. The quiet kind. The kind that arrives when you finally acknowledge the distance between what your life has been and what it could have been if you had made different decisions earlier. The kind that exists not in dramatic loss, but in the accumulated recognition of small absences. Connections that stayed shallow because you kept them there. Moments of genuine understanding that passed without being honored. Years of functioning perfectly while something essential remained untouched. That grief was real. I did not try to process it efficiently. I did not try to understand it quickly and move past it. I allowed it to exist at its actual size, which was larger than I had expected, and I sat in the presence of it until it shifted from something that needed to be managed into something that simply was. And on the other side of that grief, something unexpected was waiting. Not resolution, not answers. Not the sudden clarity that arrives in stories when a character finally confronts their fundamental truth and everything realigns around the acknowledgement. Just space. The specific kind of space that appears when you stop filling every available interior moment with maintenance, when the system goes quiet, when the walls stop requiring attention, when the exhausting work of containing everything finally, briefly, stops. In that space, something became clear that had never been clear before. I did not want to go back. Not to the performance. Not to the maintained distances. Not to the life that functioned beautifully and felt incomplete in a way I had spent years refusing to name. For the first time, the prospect of allowing something real felt less dangerous than the prospect of continuing to prevent it. That was the moment. Not dramatic. Not cinematic. Not the kind of shift that makes for a clean story with a clear turning point. Just a quiet internal reorientation. Just the moment I stopped pretending I did not need anyone and discovered that the world did not end. I want to be honest about what changed and what did not, because this is the part where stories usually promise transformation, where the acknowledgement of need led seamlessly into its fulfillment, where the walls coming down reveals waiting connection on the other side, where recognition becomes resolution, and resolution becomes the beginning of something better than everything that came before. That is not what happened. What happened was quieter and more complicated and ultimately more real than any version of that story would have been. The walls did not disappear. They became visible. And visible walls are different from invisible ones, not because they are easier to dismantle, but because you can finally see what you are choosing when you choose to maintain them. You can no longer pretend they are not there. You can no longer call them personality or preference or nature. You have to look at them directly and make a conscious decision about whether to keep them exactly as they are. That is harder than having no walls, and easier than pretending the walls are not walls. I started making different decisions, small ones at first, the kind that would not be visible to anyone observing from the outside. Staying in a conversation slightly longer than the system would have recommended. Allowing a moment of genuine feeling to exist without immediately redirecting it. answering a question honestly in a situation where a deflection would have been easier and would have cost nothing. Small decisions. But decisions carry weight, not in their individual significance, but in their accumulation. And these decisions were accumulating in a direction I had never allowed movement before, towards something real. Not perfectly, not consistently, not without the old patterns surfacing regularly and reliably, and with a familiarity that made them genuinely difficult to resist. The system does not disappear because you have recognized it. Recognition is the beginning. The work comes after. The long, quiet, unglamorous work of choosing differently in ordinary moments that no one will witness or applaud. But the direction had changed, and direction matters more than speed. I am not going to tell you that stopping the pretending solved everything, that admitting need filled the emptiness completely, that the relief I felt in that quiet evening translated immediately into a different and better way of moving through the world. It did not. What it translated into was honesty, a different relationship with my own interior, a willingness to sit with discomfort that previously would have been immediately managed, a slowly developing capacity to allow things to matter before I had determined whether allowing them to matter was safe. And something else, something I had not expected and cannot fully explain, a kind of company. Not the company of other people, though that changed too, gradually, imperfectly, in ways still unfolding, but the company of my own honesty. The specific and unfamiliar experience of existing in alignment with what was actually true rather than what was strategically comfortable. I had not known how lonely the performance was until I stopped performing. I had not known how much energy the maintenance required until the maintenance stopped. I had not known what it felt like to simply be in a room, in a thought, in a moment, without the constant background work of ensuring everything remained at a safe and manageable distance. It felt different, quieter in a new way, not the quiet of careful containment, the quiet of something that has stopped fighting. That is what I want to leave you with, not a lesson. Not a framework. Not a set of instructions for dismantling whatever version of this you have built inside your own life. Just this. The pretending costs more than the need ever would have. The walls require more energy than the openness they were built to prevent. The performance of not needing anyone is more exhausting than the vulnerability of admitting that you do. I know that now. Not as information. As experience. And experience changes things in a way that information never quite manages. So if you are somewhere inside the version of this that I lived for years, if you recognize the system, if you understand the maintenance, if you know exactly what it feels like to be present in a room while remaining fundamentally unreachable, then hear this. The exhaustion you feel is not weakness. It is honesty arriving. It is the part of you that knows the performance is not the same as living, finally finding enough quiet to make itself heard. You do not have to dismantle everything at once. You do not have to make dramatic decisions or have difficult conversations or suddenly become someone unrecognizable to yourself. You only have to stop pretending, just once. Just long enough to feel what is actually there underneath all the careful management. Because what is there? The real need, the genuine desire for connection, the authentic version of yourself that exists beneath the version you perform. That is not weakness. That is the most honest thing about you. And honesty, no matter how long it has been waiting, is always worth returning to. Always.